A Prisoner in the Caucasus, Part 1, by Leo Tolstoy. An officer named Zilin was serving in the army in the Caucasus. One day he received a letter from home. It was from his mother, who wrote, "I am getting old and should like to see my dear son once more before I die. Come and say goodbye to me, and bury me, and then, if God pleases, return to service again with my blessing. But I have found a girl for you who is sensible and good and has some property. If you can love her, you might marry her and remain at home." Zilhin thought it over. It was quite true, the old lady was failing fast, and he might not have another chance to see her alive. He had better go. And if the girl was nice, why not marry her? So he went to his colonel, obtained leave of absence, said goodbye to his comrades, stood the soldiers 4 pailfuls of vodka as a farewell treat, and got ready to go. It was a time of war in the Caucasus. The roads were not safe by night or day. If ever a Russian ventured to ride or walk any distance from his fort, the Tartars killed him or carried him off to the hills. So it had been arranged that twice every week a body of soldiers would march from one fortress to the next, to convoy travelers from point to point. It was summer. At daybreak the baggage train got ready under the shelter of the fortress. The soldiers marched out, and all started along the road. Zilhin was on horseback, and a cart with his things went with the baggage train. They had 16 miles to go. The baggage train moved slowly. Sometimes the soldiers stopped, or perhaps a wheel would come off one of the carts, or a horse refused to go on, and then everybody had to wait. When by the sun it was already past noon, they had not gone half the way. It was dusty and hot. The sun was scorching, and there was no shelter anywhere. A bare plain all around, not a tree, not a bush, by the road. Zilhin rode on in front and stopped, waiting for the baggage to overtake him. Then he heard the signal horn sounded behind him. The company had again stopped. So he began to think, "Hadn't I better ride on by myself? My horse is a good one. If the Tartars do attack me, I can gallop away. Perhaps, however, it would be wiser to wait." As he sat considering, Kostilin, an officer carrying a gun, rode up to him and said, "Come along, Zilin, let's go on by ourselves. It's dreadful. I am famished, and the heat is terrible. My shirt is wringing wet." Kostilin was a stout, heavy man, and the perspiration was running down his red face. Zilin thought a while and then asked, "Is your gun loaded?" "Yes, it is." "Well then, let's go, but on condition that we keep together." So they rode forward along the road across the plain, talking, but keeping a lookout on both sides. They could see afar all round, but after crossing the plain, the road ran through a valley between 2 hills, and Zilhin said, "We had better climb that hill and have a look around, or the Tartars may be on us before we know it." But Kostilin answered, "What's the use? Let us go on." Zilhin, however, would not agree. "No," he said, "you can wait here if you like, but I'll go and look around." And he turned his horse to the left, up the hill. Zilin's horse was a hunter, and carried him up the hillside as if it had wings. He had bought it for 100 rubles as a colt out of the herd, and had broken it in himself. Hardly had he reached the top of the hill, when he saw some 30 Tartars, not much more than 100 yards ahead of him. As soon as he caught sight of them, he turned round, but the Tartars had also seen him, and rushed after him at full gallop, getting their guns out as they went. Down galloped Zilin, as fast as the horse's legs could go, shouting to Kostilin, "Get your gun ready!" And, in thought, he said to his horse, "Get me well out of this, my pet. Don't stumble, for if you do, it's all up. Once I reach the gun, they shan't take me prisoner." But instead of waiting, Kostilin, as soon as he caught sight of the Tartars, turned back towards the fortress at full speed, whipping his horse, now on one side, now on the other, and its switching tail was all that could be seen of him in the dust. Zilin saw it was a bad lookout. The gun was gone, and what could he do with nothing but his sword? He turned his horse toward the escort, thinking to escape, but there were 6 Tartars rushing to cut him off. His horse was a good one, but theirs were still better. And besides, they were across his path. He tried to rein in his horse and to turn another way, but it was going so fast it could not stop, and dashed on straight toward the Tartars. He saw a red-bearded Tartar on a gray horse, with his gun raised, coming at him, yelling and showing his teeth. "Ah," thought Zilin, "I know you, devils that you are. If you take me alive, you'll put me in a pit and flog me. I will not be taken alive." Zilin, though not a big fellow, was brave. He drew his sword and dashed at the red-bearded Tartar, thinking, "Either I'll ride him down or disable him with my sword." He was still a horse's length away from him when he was fired at from behind, and his horse was hit. It fell to the ground with all its weight, pinning Zilin to the earth. He tried to rise, but 2 ill-savoured Tartars were already sitting on him and binding his hands behind his back. He made an effort and flung them off, but 3 others jumped from their horses and began beating his head with the butts of their guns. His eyes grew dim, and he fell back. The Tartars seized him, and taking spare girths from their saddles, twisted his hands behind him and tied them with the Tartar knot. They knocked his cap off, pulled off his boots, searched him all over, tore his clothes, and took his money and his watch. Zilin looked round at his horse. There it lay on its side, poor thing, just as it had fallen, struggling, its legs in the air, unable to touch the ground. There was a hole in its head, and black blood was pouring out, turning the dust to mud for a couple of feet around. One of the Tartars went up to the horse and began taking the saddle off. It still kicked, so he drew a dagger and cut its windpipe. A whistling sound came from its throat. The horse gave one plunge, and all was over. The Tartars took the saddle and trappings. The red-bearded Tartar mounted his horse, and the others lifted Zilin into the saddle behind him. To prevent his falling off, they strapped him to the Tartar's girdle, and then they all rode away to the hills. So there sat Zilin, swaying from side to side, his head striking against the Tartar's stinking back. He could see nothing but that muscular back and sinewy neck, with its closely shaven, bluish nape. Zilin's head was wounded. The blood had dried over his eyes, and he could neither shift his position on the saddle nor wipe the blood off. His arms were bound so tightly that his collarbones ached. They rode up and down hills for a long way. Then they reached a river which they forded, and came to a hard road leading across a valley. Zilin tried to see where they were going, but his eyelids were stuck together with blood, and he could not turn. Twilight began to fall. They crossed another river and rode up a stony hillside. There was a smell of smoke here, and dogs were barking. They had reached an Aeol, a Tartar village. The Tartars got off their horses. Tartar children came and stood round Zilin, shrieking with pleasure and throwing stones at him. The Tartar drove the children away, took Zilin off the horse, and called to his man, "A Nogai with high cheekbones, and nothing on but a shirt, and that so torn that his breast was all bare," answered the call. The Tartar gave him an order. He went and fetched shackles, 2 blocks of oak with iron rings attached, and a clasp and lock fixed to one of the rings. They untied Zilin's arms, fastened the shackles on his leg, and dragged him to a barn, where they pushed him in and locked the door. Zilin fell on a heap of manure. He lay still a while, then groped about to find a soft place, and settled down.